guys, welcome back to In Case of Econ Struggles. And today I'm going to talk about dominant firm theory graphically. So I'm going to explain the assumptions of this model and talk about how we get the graph for dominant firm theory. Per usual, timestamps are below if you would like to jump around, but let's go ahead and get right into it. We're going to have four main assumptions of the dominant firm model. The first is that we're going to have one dominant firm. They're going to have a cost advantage over the other firms, and they're going to have the ability to set prices in the market. So the dominant firm is sort of one player. The other player or the other players in this market, there could be one, there could be many, there could be some. They're going to be smaller firms. They're what we call the competitive fringe. Basically, what's going to happen is they're going to be price takers in this market, and they're going to take the price the dominant firm sets as given. And then finally, we're going to assume that the competitive fringe supplies first, and that the dominant firm is just going to take whatever supply the competitive fringe puts out as sort of given, and they're going to fill in the rest of the demand that's not fulfilled by the competitive fringe. And so if we just take a quick pass at what this graph is ultimately going to look like, for example, here's a cell phone market where you've got one dominant cell phone maker and you've got a couple other competitive fringe cell phone makers. You can see that this graph is getting really complicated. It looks really messy. And so what we're going to do is we're going to build this graph step by step. I'll talk about the assumptions and how we get certain lines from our assumptions. And then hopefully this graph will make a lot more sense. So again, here's that same graph. You can see that we've got a marginal cost for the competitive fringe, and that's above the marginal cost for the dominant firm, or MCDF. And of course, that's because we've assumed that the dominant firm has a cost advantage over the competitive fringe. If they have a cost advantage, their marginal cost must be below the marginal cost for the other firms. That's how I've drawn it here. That's why this purple line is below the blue line. We've got this demand curve. I'm going to delineate this. This is going to be sort of the industry demand curve, where this is sort of overall demand, both for the competitive fringe and the dominant firm's product. And so now what we need to do is we need to figure out what the dominant firm's demand function is. Because they're supplying whatever the competitive fringe does not supply, their demand curve is going to look slightly different. And so first what we're going to notice is we're going to think about the competitive fringe, because those are competitive firms and so they're price takers, and so they're going to set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. But marginal revenue is coming off the demand curve for competitive firms, because marginal revenue is just price for competitive firms in a competitive market. And so what you notice is that, okay, here's the marginal cost. So this is like the competitive fringe supply curve. Okay, this point right here, this is the price at which the competitive firms are willing to supply 0 units. So this is where the competitive fringe is going to drop out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a little line all the way across here. And I'm going to call this the price at which the competitive fringe shuts down, or where the dominant firm is the only supplier in the market. And that's going to be helpful in a second. So I'm just going to make that dashed so that hopefully it doesn't get too much in the way. The other thing to notice is that if you think about this price right here, this is where the marginal cost is equal to the demand curve. And so if you didn't have a dominant firm, this would be the price that would prevail in the competitive market, which means if the competitive fringe is meeting all the demand, then the dominant firm is not supplying at all, because all of the supply is coming from the competitive fringe. There's nothing left over for the dominant firm to supply. And so this is going to be what I call a P star. And this is in the competitive equilibrium, or CE. And if you were to drop down from this point right here, this would tell you your Q star in the competitive market. So maybe I'll do that as well. So this right here, if you didn't have a dominant firm, you'd be chilling at Q star for a competitive equilibrium, because you would only have perfectly competitive firms, so you'd be in a perfectly competitive market. Now that we have that, we can figure out what the demand curve is for the dominant firm. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to say, well, at this point, at P star CE, when the dominant firm is supplying nothing, that means the demand for the dominant firm's product is exactly 0, because the competitive fringe is supplying all of the goods in this market. And then when we get to this price down here, the competitive fringe shutdown price, we know that the dominant firm is now going to be the only player in the market. And so what we can do is we know that right here, right at this shutdown price, the dominant firm is now supplying the entire market demand. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to take this guy and we're going to connect them with a straight line. After the shutdown price, well, now the dominant firm is the one who's only supplying in this market. And so their demand function is just going to follow industry demand all the way down to Q equals 0. So I'm going to call this DDF. And now what we can do, because the dominant firm is a price setter and not a price taker, they are going to look at where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. And so we need a marginal revenue curve on this graph for the dominant firm as well. And so our marginal revenue curve is just going to have twice the slope of our demand curve. I'm only going to draw it for the up to where the dominant firm demand touches the industry demand. So maybe it looks something like this. And this is our marginal revenue for the dominant firm, or MRDF. Now we have everything we need to start thinking about what is the equilibrium price and quantity in this market. Specifically, how much is total quantity, how much are the competitive fringe supplying, how much is the dominant firm supplying. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to say, well, I know that if I'm a price setter, I'm going to look where my marginal revenue is equal to my marginal cost. And so what we're going to have is we're going to have this quantity right here. I'm going to put this quantity up top because I have a little more room. So this is going to be Q star for the dominant firm. So maybe I'll do that again in sort of this dashed line so it stays out of the way as much as possible. And now we think about, okay, well, if I'm a price setter, I'm going to take where my marginal revenue equals my marginal cost. I'm going to go up to my demand function, and that's where I find the price. So that's going to be right here. And so I can shift over like this. And this is my P star of the dominant firm, so DF. Again, I'm going to do my best to sort of make this a dashed line so that we can sort of fit a bunch of stuff in here. So again, now what we've got so far is we know the quantity the dominant firm is supplying, and we know the price they're going to charge. Now the competitive fringe is going to take that price as given, and so they're going to set marginal cost equal to the marginal revenue, which is now this P star DF. And so that's going to meet right here. And so if I go down from here, and again, I'm going to go up this way as well, this is going to be Q star CF. And again, I'm just going to make this a dashed line just so we can see it a little better. If I wanted to know total quantity in the market, then what I could do is I could just take this P star DF. I could go all the way over to the world demand curve, which is going to be something like right there. And this is going to be Q star total, like that. Okay, and so now what I've done is I've basically found everything that I want. I know what the price in this market is. I know how much total quantity demanded is or quantity supplied. And I also know how much the competitive fringe and the dominant firm are supplying. So again, if this is confusing, if you're not sure what's happening, please go ahead and put a question in the comment below if you want me to explain something again. Also a great thing for a comment. What I want to do is now I want to take the same graph. I'm going to make it a little simpler where I don't put so many P stars and things like that in it. And then we're just going to shift one of these curves and we're going to ask what happens when one of the curves shifts. Okay, so now that we've got the same curve, all I've done is I've chopped out the stuff about the competitive equilibrium just to try and make this a little more readable. So maybe, I don't know, let's do something fun. Suppose what's happening is that for some reason the dominant firm, their cost increase. And so now their cost, instead of looking like that pink line, we're going to go up to sort of this purple line that's going to look something like this. Okay, so here's MCDF1. And so now let's think about what happens to this market when costs for the dominant firm go up. Well, if you're thinking intuitively, okay, the dominant firm, the costs go up, which means the price is going to go up, but the quantity is going to go down. Okay, well, if the price goes up, then the competitive fringe is going to now have a higher marginal revenue because the price is higher, and so they're probably going to be willing to supply more. And so the relative quantity shares in this market are probably going to change where the dominant firm supplies less and the competitive fringe is probably going to supply more. How is that going to work in terms of the ultimate balance? Probably going to be less quantity in the market because we're going to follow the industry demand curve, but let's just see what happens. So now I'm going to do these new equilibrium sort of in this light green color. And so now what I'm going to see is same sort of deal. I'm going to now have that this is where my marginal cost or my new marginal cost for the dominant firm is equal to the marginal revenue, which hasn't changed. So I'm going to go down like this. And this is going to be Q star 1 DF, just to denote that that's a new one. So you can see already that this quantity is shifting in. We're going to go up to our demand curve, and we're going to be right about here. And so you can see that the price the dominant firm is charging, that is going up. So this is now P star DF1. And so we went up a little bit from this green line. And now the competitive fringe, they're facing a higher price. They're willing to supply more. So this is the new Q star CF1. And if we go over to the demand function, you can see that what's happened is the overall quantity has gone down, which makes sense because the price in the market has gone up. You would expect the quantity to go down. Hasn't gone down that much, but you can see that the relative split between the competitive fringe and the dominant firm has changed, where the competitive fringe is now producing a little bit more, supplying a little bit more, and the QDF, or the dominant firm, is supplying relatively less than they did before in terms of overall market supply. So just a really simple example, you can shift this graph in a lot of different ways. Again, if you're confused, if you've got questions, feel free to put those in the comments below. But if this helped you, if these videos in general are helping you out, please also let me know in the comments below. Please like this video. Please subscribe if you haven't already. We'll see you next time for another case of Econ Struggles.